So it's hard to believe it's been a decade since 2015, and I don't think I tell a lie when I say that the vast majority of us way back then were super hyped and excited for the prospect of new Star Wars films, new Star Wars content. Most of us still had a lot of trust that Lucasfilm knew what they were doing. The prospect of there being new Star Wars content that were bringing back the original trilogy characters, and again, people don't really remember this, or if they do, they choose to ignore it. The prospect of moving away from the George Lucas era was quite an exciting one. Returning to traditional filmmaking with, practical sets. I remember that during the Comic-Con reel in 2015, they made a big deal about the fact that they were going to limit the use of digital technology, which had, and again, this might be something that, for those of you who weren't around or too young to remember the prequels, was a big bugbear for a lot of people. They really did not like the fact that George Lucas had gone fully into the CGI era, and it really gave the prequel films a unique look, but it also made them feel a bit off. The fact that everything looked too clean, looked like computer graphics, just didn't sit well for a lot of people. And so a big thing for Lucasfilm at the time was trying to encourage the idea that, no, we're going back to practical sets, we're going to, make this on actual film. All of that was kind of put into the promotional material alongside all of the other exciting things. And I remember back then, it is the most hyped I've ever been for something. You could not find me in a state of less excitement than in the period of like October to December 2015. All of the promotional material, all of the news that we were getting, the trailers, and just the kind of, unforetold potential for all of these stories. Everything looked great. Everything looked crisp and clean in those trailers. And, I was just really excited. And I think the vast majority of you were too. There wasn't this kind of toxic online culture back then that really just got too involved in supposed culture wars and politics. It was just a case of, we're all Star Wars fans and we just enjoyed it regardless of, the cast's race, sexuality, whatever it was. We just got on and enjoyed the fact that there was more Star Wars coming out. And the reason I kind of want to make this video is for the benefit of those who, maybe don't know about my previous content, who maybe have joined the channel recently, because I have made a few videos on the sequel trilogy recently. For example, the video about the First Order Resistance War. That was quite popular. There was a lot of comments about, people's opinions on that. And I realized that, I'd not injected a whole lot of my own opinion into the video, which is fine. That's kind of how I want those style of videos to be, because then what I can do is, if I feel the need to impress my opinions on you, I can do a video like this. But with those kinds of videos, I like to just stick with the facts and the lore about, the structure of things, and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, and try and remain as neutral as possible. And I like to think I did that, but a lot of you maybe don't know what my opinions on the sequels are, and so that's why I want to sit down and talk about it with you in this video, because my opinions have changed a bit over the years, as everyone's opinions tend to do. With hindsight, you learn to appreciate things. You also learn to spot things that you actually don't quite like, that don't make sense. So I kind of want to just sit down, and even if you do know of all of my old content, because again, for the benefit of those who don't know, I had a different channel called My Name is Simon. In fact, the very first video I made proper for that channel was a Star Wars review for The Force Awakens. And as time went on, although I wasn't laser focused on Star Wars for every video, I did kind of keep in touch with Star Wars. I'd always make reviews, I'd watch the shows that came out, and I would not be afraid of voicing my opinion at the time. But voicing your opinion nowadays is a dangerous thing, because the community has become so divided that whenever you voice your opinion, you open yourself up to criticism, which isn't something that bothers me, but sometimes you don't want to have to put up with the hassle of it. And so I just try and avoid it nowadays, because I could go out and I could say, on both sides of the coin, I could say that, for example, I really love The Acolyte, and I would get a group of people jumping down my throat saying, oh, it's woke, it's DEI, it's rubbish, and you are rubbish for liking it. And on the opposite side, if I said, oh, I hate the Acolyte, I get a bunch of people who are taking, obviously their defense of diversity way too far, and they will say, oh, well, you're just one of those horrible people who hate things because of diversity. And again, that's only the minority, but it tends to be the most vocal of the minority. They are the loudest people in the community. Now, I've always maintained that the vast majority of the Star Wars fandom is not terminally online. They tend to avoid online conversation about Star Wars. They don't pay attention to the online community. They just get on with their life. They enjoy Star Wars. They don't care about the politics or the culture war. And, they tend to like what they like and dislike what they don't like. But the people online shout the loudest. Thankfully, it only tends to affect those people online. So it's kind of, a give and take situation. So that's why, on this channel at least, I try and avoid too many opinion pieces and try and keep it to lore. So when we talk about the sequel trilogy, obviously, I was very, very, very excited for The Force Awakens, as was the vast majority of the community. I will not lie and say that I didn't particularly enjoy the prequels. I still don't think that they're the greatest pieces of work. I can appreciate them in hindsight for what they were trying to do. And this argument is probably going to sound quite similar for the sequels, ironically. But again, I just think that George Lucas came a little bit too soon with wanting to delve into the heavy CGI. George Lucas is not the best dialogue writer. And I think that's why you'll find that the best Star Wars content under George Lucas comes from a collaboration. When George gives his vision, his creative stories to a director and a writer who can hone them, who can fine-tune them. And that's what the original trilogies were. Obviously, the exception was the first film, A New Hope. But even then, George had editors who helped to really tighten things up. Empire Strikes Back, you had the collaboration with Irvin Kershner, Lawrence Kasdan, and again, similar for Return of the Jedi. George was less involved in the actual direct filmmaking, and so they all turned out to be the, amazing films that we all know and love today. And the prequels were kind of the opposite. George had full control. He was writing them, he was directing them, he was editing them, and, obviously there were people there helping him, but at that point it became much more of a George Lucas-controlled element for those films. And that's why I think they turned out to be far more different than the original trilogy, and that's not bad. George Lucas is known for really wanting to make changes and innovations with each film he makes, and he has made some amazing innovations. This isn't a criticism of George Lucas, but I think it's good to have the perspective that George Lucas is not a god, he is not perfect, and the fandom realised that after the prequels came out. The fandom was quite cold on George Lucas by the end, and I think especially when they realised he wasn't going to be making any more films, there was a lot of disinterest there, and so people were looking to new avenues, trying to find somewhere that we would get new Star Wars content, and so along came Disney. And again, a lot of us put our faith in Lucasfilm at that point, Kathleen Kennedy, all those people who, were going to be involved in this new era. And so we got to The Force Awakens. And again, I remember going and watching that film several times and absolutely loving it. Really just embracing the vibe, embracing, the kind of theme of it, even though I knew that it was a very close copy to A New Hope. It was just such an enjoyable experience. It was such a good story, It was just a great sci-fi action film. It was a space adventure, and that's what the originals were. So I wasn't paying attention to, oh, well, this happened in A New Hope, and this also happened in A New Hope. I was just like, yes, that's Han Solo, and that's the Han Solo I remember. And I really like this Finn guy. He seems quite quirky, and, he was a former stormtrooper. That was quite interesting. And Rey, she's this kind of impressionable young woman who, clearly has the whole destiny thing behind her, and I wasn't fully expecting her to be the lead role, but that's interesting. I want to see how that goes. Kylo Ren is this really interesting villain who we've never seen before. The young, unsure angry man. He is inexperienced. He is kind of got a chip on his shoulder, rather than, we've got all of the wizened old villains like Palpatine, or the in control kind of monsters like Vader. He was just fresh and, malleable, and you wanted to see where his story was going to go, because you knew he was going to be easily influenced. You wanted to see, which side he'd end up on. And, again, the action scenes were great. The lightsaber fight in the forest at the end with the snow is one of the most visually impressive things that I've seen. And, I still put that right up there as number 2 in my all-time favourite list of, saber fights. And so the film, for me, still holds up. I know that a lot of people will mark it down for being a carbon copy of A New Hope. That's fine. But to me, that didn't matter. I just enjoyed, the pacing. It was a fast-paced action film. There was very little in the way of MacGuffins. I know we had the whole find the map to Luke, or find Luke through the map, but that was kind of a smaller element of the film's, kind of purpose. It was kind of introducing these new characters, bringing back the old, catching us up. And yes, don't get me wrong, there was so much more that it could have done better in terms of the world building, the politics behind it. Wiping out the New Republic was a big mistake. Having us just kind of regurgitate the First Order resistance thing being rebels versus Empire, yes, that was kind of a big mistake. But I think that when you look at it from the perspective of a singular film, it still stands up. And again, back then, we all assumed that, well, it's okay because the second film will go into those details. Because again, if you look at A New Hope, it doesn't really do vast amounts of world building. It's just a fun, action-packed adventure that gives you enough to know what's going on. Good guys, bad guys, enough. And obviously at that point, they weren't sure if it was going to be a trilogy, but Empire really then starts to go into the wider story. And so we were thinking, the next one will do that. Hindsight 2020, we know that didn't quite happen. And again, we all know the reasons for that. But for me, The Force Awakens has not really changed in terms of my opinion. I've always still really loved that film. I will happily sit down, put it on, watch it, and just enjoy it with that sense of nostalgia. And it is weird now that I'm thinking of these films as nostalgia. Because that's what it is. It's 10 years. It's 10 years since they came out. And, we're all 10 years older now. And we're all in different places in our life. So I think that, with that perspective, there's nothing wrong with looking back and just enjoying it for what it is. But then we move on to The Last Jedi. And so, obviously, similar situation. Between The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens, we had Rogue One, which is, again, another film that I really enjoy. I know it's got its faults. I know that some people don't like just how much of, it's a fan service film. But again, similar. Fast-paced, action-packed. Yeah, the characters aren't really built in depth, but when you're going to kill them all off, does it really need that much? No, just sit down, enjoy it, and, take it for what it is. It's a war film. And it has, to me, the second best space battle, again, outside of Return of the Jedi. So, again, I was really happy with that. But looking forward to The Last Jedi, the reasons that I was really hyped for this was the fact that we were getting Luke. Luke missing from The Force Awakens was probably the only thing that I really held against the film, because I really wanted to see Luke Skywalker and what he'd gotten up to, why had he abandoned, the galaxy as a whole. And so the idea that The Last Jedi was going to give us those answers, and we were going to move into the next step and find out more about Snoke and see Kylo's next steps, that really excited me, because we were getting more of, Star Wars. And so when it came out, safe to say, and you have to appreciate that I went to the midnight viewings of these. I came back home straight away, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, because it's a long film. And I just put on my webcam and I just unloaded my thoughts. And it turned out to be the most popular film video on that channel. And again, that was the early signs of how making negative content was the moneymaker. And I never latched onto that because I never wanted to, but I could have very easily just carried on in that mold. And I think 2017 was that era where clickbait, rage bait really started to progress and grow. And again, I could have so easily fallen into that trap because I genuinely did not like the film. I genuinely hated The Last Jedi. Again, there were elements of it I could appreciate. It's a beautiful looking film. It's got great, again, action scenes, but I hated the decisions they made in that film. I hated the Marvel-style comedy, the Yo Mama joke in the first 5 minutes, Luke throwing the saber away. It was in those first 5 minutes I knew, oh no, something is wrong here. And I could not just help but think all the way through the film, this doesn't make sense. And I know it sounds counterintuitive to what I've just said about The Force Awakens, but with The Last Jedi, the kind of holes in the story were so much bigger than just, this is the same as A New Hope, this is the same as that. It was, why are they doing that? Why can't they do this? Why aren't they doing that? Why are they acting this way? What's the purpose of that story? I hated how Finn was sidelined into a story with Rose, and I like Rose as a character, but I really wanted Finn to continue on with that kind of lead role. I really wanted him to carry on with, to be honest, training with a lightsaber. Even if he wasn't necessarily going to be a full-on Jedi, I felt like, there's a potential here to show that, well, maybe a non-Force user could still use a weapon of a Jedi, and that's how the Jedi could evolve. Don't just make it exclusive to Force users, open up the Jedi to people who believe and who want to help. And we never got that. Finn went off on this kind of side mission that ultimately never paid off. I mean, he went to go and disable the tracker, and they didn't do it. And they ended up crashed on Crate, and it was pointless. They could have stayed on the ship, and there would be no difference in the story. I mean, outside of them going to Canto Bight and realizing that, war is bad, and that people who make money off weapons are bad, what else did that story achieve? Nothing, really. And I still hold that opinion. I think that Finn's story was completely mishandled. And, yes, what I would say about The Last Jedi is, sitting here 10 years later, or 8 years later now, I do appreciate it more for it trying to be different. I appreciate Rian Johnson for trying to take us away from some of the core elements to grow the story. And I actually really like Rian Johnson as a filmmaker. I like Looper. I love the Knives Out films. So it's not, that's Zuko, it's not a criticism of Rian Johnson per se as a filmmaker. It's a criticism of Rian Johnson for this film. Because I just feel like it did not work. Luke, at the time, Luke dying really pissed me off. Really, really pissed me off, because I'd waited for so long to see him on screen, and it felt like we didn't get enough of him. He didn't do as much as I was hoping. Apologies, that's Zuko on the cat tree again. He likes to interrupt these videos, which is why I try and, not do these long format face-to-face videos. Do you mind, mister? Hey? He's also closed the door, which now means I can hear the reverberation more. He's just sabotaging this video for the sake of it. He's a cat, what do you expect? But I remember just being really, really pissed off at the time that Luke did not have as much of an involvement as I really wanted him to. And then dying. And I get that he made the heroic sacrifice, which is what a Jedi would do, but I wanted more. I wanted him to be involved in the last film. I'd waited this long, and then he's gone. And so that really pissed me off. But again, 8 years later, it doesn't affect me as bad. I don't necessarily think his story was as botched, but I would have liked to have seen him go a different direction than, oh, he's abandoned the Order, he stopped. I would have liked to have seen him succeed. And even if we had to see him go through the whole crisis of faith from the beginning, that would have been better than catching up with him at the end of it. Because I wanted to see Luke reap the rewards of fighting in the original trilogy, and I never really got that, and so that still kind of bugs me a little bit, but not as much as it used to. So when I look at The Last Jedi, I sit there and I think, yes, there is a lot wrong with it. I still don't particularly enjoy it as a film. However, my opinion of it in the last 8 years has gone up somewhat. I don't hate it. I don't think it's garbage like some people will say. Even if at the time I did, I still now can say I respect it for what it was trying to do. I think that it was misguided and it was ill executed. And that is partly because of the film I'm going to move on to now, which is The Rise of Skywalker, which has kind of done the opposite for me. At the time, I didn't particularly enjoy it. Again, going into that film, I was like, okay, this is the last one. They've got a lot to tie up, a lot to do in that. So I was kind of doubting the film from the get-go, whereas with the previous two, I went into it with excitement and hope. With this one, I was like, okay, how are they going to do this? And then they announced Palpatine coming back. And at first I was like, yes, I love Palpatine. That's great. Ian McDiarmid, let's go. And as time went on, I was kind of like, okay, but having Palpatine back, what does that do to the story overall? But I put it to the back of my mind. I went and watched the film, and I definitely saw the problems with the film. I definitely felt like it wasn't as good as it should have been. I felt like it didn't round off the story in a way that felt rewarding. And it didn't, help that it again kind of contravened all of the stuff The Last Jedi tried to do. It made Rey a Palpatine, and, it kind of went away from the idea of the Jedi and the Sith have to end and kind of went back to the Jedi versus the Sith. And so, I definitely knew sitting in the cinema, there's something's wrong here. But at the time, I kind of was like, okay, that's kind of a cool action scene. It's great seeing Palpatine back. It looks great, even if it does have kind of a little blue filter on it. I thought it was kind of intriguing, but I came out the cinema still thinking, yeah, I don't think I really enjoyed that. I don't think it was great, but I don't think it was as bad as The Last Jedi. And it's only been over the last 6-7 years since its release that I have kind of rewatched it, and it's dawned on me that that is actually the worst of the sequel films. It is hot garbage, because they just throw nonsensical Deus Ex Machinas at the story over and over and over again. I've mentioned it in that video about the Resistance versus the First Order, that it doesn't make sense that at the end of The Last Jedi, you've got 20 Resistance fighters. At the beginning of the Rise of Skywalker, in the story, it's a year later, they're fully armed again, and there's hundreds and thousands of them, and they've got all these ships. It's like, where did that come from? And then you've got 19,000 ships showing up in the space of like 12 hours to help them in Exegol. And it's like, where did that come from? And why is Palpatine being so stupid in announcing that he's coming back when he should just launch his fleet? And why have we got a fleet of planet-killing Star Destroyers? That doesn't make sense. They look like Imperial class, which is great. I love the Imperial class, but they're supposed to be twice as big, but the scale is the same. So does that mean that the windows are twice as big? So people are just sat there with these massive windows? All these things kind of now come into my head since. And I just really... I don't often say I hate a film, but I think I hate The Rise of Skywalker for how it just took such a coward's approach. Rather than trying to take what The Last Jedi had done and try and at least fulfill it in a way that matched, the tone and the story and what it was going for, it just did a complete 180. And I suppose, is it surprising when it's the same director from the first film? But again, that main core of not having that established story really made these films suffer. But again, that's the only film out of the three which has seen my opinion worsen on it. The Force Awakens, it's always remained very high. Absolutely love the film. I'm not going to bother defending it. I know if you don't like it, that's fair. But I really, really like it. Last Jedi, hated it when it came out. Now I've kind of got a begrudging respect, but still really don't like it. Rise of Skywalker, didn't really like it when it came out. Didn't bother me too much, because at that point it was like, okay, well that's it. Now I kind of really hate it, and I don't really want to watch it ever again or be reminded of it. So that's kind of where I sit now. And it does show you how, over time, people's opinions can change. I'm sure that your opinion has changed on it. And I would love to know in the comments, how has your opinion of those sequel films changed in the 10 years since they started? Because I can guarantee some of you will say, well, yeah, I'm more forgiving of this now. Some of you may say, well, actually, no, I really don't like this. Back then, I really liked it. But it's the same, prequels. I mentioned this earlier. People either too young or just put on the rose-tinted spectacles and don't remember the fact that the prequels really got the rough time of it. And that's part of why George gave up, because they were lambasted for their nonsensical stories, their, really poorly thought out scripts in terms of the dialogue and the pacing and the visuals, the looks of the films. I'm sure that at the time they looked unique because, it was the first time we were seeing CGI. But again, this isn't to super criticize the prequels. It's to give perspective that people didn't think George Lucas was perfect. People wanted away from the George Lucas style. And that's why we were excited for these new films. And I think that, yes, over time, people's opinions will soften. People will still have those opinions of, I don't like them, but we're not going to have as sharp or fierce, an argument about it going forward. But that's me. That's how I think of the sequels. So any videos I make about the sequels going forward, please keep that in mind. That's my opinions behind it, but it will not affect, any videos that I make about the core structure of that era, I will always treat it fairly. I will treat it with the same, logical sense of perspective that I've always done. And my personal opinions will very rarely creep into videos that I make about lore or about the story itself and what makes sense and what doesn't. So, as Zuko tries to interrupt one more time, I will thank you for watching. Again, please do let me know in the comments how your opinions have changed, and I will see you for the next video.